Isabella Gray stood at the grand entrance of the lavish wedding. The soft hum of orchestral music and clinking champagne glasses echoing from the ballroom beyond. 14 years had passed since the night her family threw her out into the cold, branding her as worthless, a burden. She'd only been 18, a scared girl with nothing but a duffel bag and a heart full of shattered trust. Now, at 32, she wasn't here to beg for acceptance or forgiveness. She was here to remind them that the girl they discarded had become a woman they could never ignore. As her heels clicked across the marble floor, heads turned, her mother stiffened, her eyes narrowing with icy contempt. Her sister, Eliza, the ever-perfect golden child, sneered and demanded to know who invited her. But it was Eliza's fiancé, Marcus, who froze. Recognition flickered in his eyes, his face draining of color. Isabella smiled softly. The past hadn't been kind, but it had forged her into something unbreakable. Years of silence, struggle, and sacrifice had led to this moment. The whispers started when Isabella calmly revealed Eliza's secret, that she never graduated medical school. A truth backed by records pulled from dusty archives. And when Isabella hinted at financial fraud within the family clinic, her father's facade cracked. Their world, built on illusion, began to crumble. She hadn't come with hate, only with facts, evidence, and resolve. And with Adam, her husband, standing by her side, she made it clear, she was no longer the forgotten daughter. She was the reckoning. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was enough to unravel the lies they clung to. Isabella had rebuilt herself from ashes, brick by painful brick, and now stood taller than any of them. As security moved toward her in confusion, unsure who to believe, Marcus reached for the USB drive Isabella handed him. Inside, the truth. Years of manipulation, embezzlement, and deception, laid bare. By the time he'd seen the files, Eliza was already weeping, her wedding dreams in ruins. Isabella didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Her silence said it all. I survived. I thrived. And you were wrong about me. With a final glance around the trembling room, Isabella turned, walking away from the wreckage of the family that never truly saw her. Outside, the city lights greeted her like old friends. Adam slipped his hand into hers. No words needed. For Isabella Gray, revenge was never the goal. Power wasn't even the prize. What mattered most was something deeper: peace, dignity, and the quiet satisfaction of justice served cold. As the ballroom faded behind her, Isabella knew she was finally free. 10 years ago, Isabella Gray was thrown out of her family estate during a violent storm. Falsely accused of stealing $5 million from the family business. Her father's words, "You're not my child anymore," still echoed in her mind. The betrayal cut deeper than the rain that soaked her body, deeper than the muddy ground she fell into when her half-brother Ethan kicked her toward the gate. Vivian, her stepmother, stood in the doorway with her mother's wedding ring in hand, ripped from the family safe, and hurled it at her face with venomous spite. Her Aunt Susan clutched her necklace and shouted curses, while the staff watched through frosted windows. With no money, no allies, and only a waterlogged suitcase filled with ruined memories, Isabella wandered into the night, lost and broken. But rock bottom was where her rebirth began. She slept beneath awnings, huddled against the cold. She pawned her last valuables to pay for food and rent in a roach-infested apartment. She scrubbed diner floors, dodged leering customers, and learned what survival really meant. Then came the night a stranger tried to lure her into a trap, a man offering easy work, who turned violent when she refused. She escaped with a slash across her shoulder, hiding in a dumpster, trembling and bloody. That night, fate threw her a lifeline: Jack Donovan, a former stockbroker ruined by a crooked deal. Jack recognized her fire and offered her something no one else had: belief. They formed an unlikely partnership, two broken people, rebuilding from scratch. Together, they studied late nights in libraries, analyzing stock charts on public computers. Isabella absorbed everything: finance, markets, strategy. Within months, they made their first trade. It was small, risky, and terrifying, but it worked. The rush of success lit a fire in her veins. From there, Isabella and Jack built something real. A financial firm, a name, a future. Over a decade, she transformed from a broken girl to a self-made powerhouse. But despite the wealth and success, the past never truly let go. Her family still walked free. Vivian still enjoyed the Carter fortune. Ethan ran the business he helped destroy. And Susan, her loyal enabler, still lived in comfort. They thought she was gone. But Isabella had been watching. Susan was first. Superstitious and paranoid, she became the perfect target. Isabella sent her fragments of the falsified ledgers used to frame her. Anonymous calls whispered her mother's name at midnight. Fear consumed Susan, who eventually handed over her savings to a con artist, psychic, Isabella had planted. When Isabella visited, she dropped the fake ledger on Susan's table and told her calmly, "You taught me how to survive. Now, I'm teaching you what fear feels like." Susan was never the same. Ethan was next. For years, Isabella secretly acquired shares of Carter Industries. When she held enough power, she walked into the annual shareholders meeting in a sleek black suit and called a vote to remove Ethan as CEO. When he asked who she was, she met his eyes and said, "I'm the nightmare you created." The vote passed. Furious, Ethan hired thugs to take her out. But she escaped. Jack tracked down the hitman, who confessed everything on video. Isabella leaked it online. By noon, Ethan was in cuffs, charged with attempted murder and fraud. He got life without parole. Next came Vivian, the puppet master. Isabella exposed her years of embezzlement with a quiet tip to federal investigators. Within days, Vivian's accounts were frozen. Her house was seized, but Vivian retaliated, having Isabella arrested on trumped-up charges. In jail, she endured weeks of threats and violence from inmates paid off by Vivian. Jack, working around the clock, unearthed a drunken audio recording of Vivian bragging about setting her up. It flipped the case. Isabella walked free. Vivian, on the other hand, was sentenced to 20 years. Then, the final piece, her father. Once a towering figure in her life, he now lived in a shabby assisted living home. Too broke to afford anything better. She found him sitting alone in a tattered recliner, staring at a blank television. His voice was weak. "I messed up, kid, but it was too late." He had chosen them over her. Yet when she found a hidden letter, a torn, never sent apology written the week she was thrown out, her anger faltered. He wasn't evil, just weak. She handed him a check to cover his expenses and walked away. He died a few months later. Alone. In the end, Isabella didn't just reclaim her name. She buried the old one. She turned pain into power, fear into fire. With Jack still by her side, she created a scholarship in her mother's name for kids from broken homes. And slowly, something inside her softened. One summer, at a lake house Jack had rented, under the stars and the crackling fire, he told her he loved her. She hadn't seen it coming. But in that quiet moment, with no revenge left to pursue, she realized what she'd been missing all along. She took his hand and smiled. "Let's just stay like this a while," she said. The war was over, and for the first time in her life, Isabella Gray was truly free. Isabella Gray never asked for the spotlight, especially not on a day meant for someone else. Yet there she was, standing at the back of the grand ballroom. The scent of champagne and roses hanging thick in the air, every crystal chandelier reflecting judgment from the eyes that once looked down on her. She hadn't been invited, but she didn't need an invitation to crash her sister's perfect wedding. 14 years earlier, her family had discarded her like garbage, declaring her a burden, unworthy, and sending her into the cold with nothing but a suitcase and a broken heart. At just 18, she'd been tossed out, her father indifferent, her mother cold, and her golden child sister, Elle, smirking with satisfaction as the door slammed shut. They thought that night was the end of Isabella. But it was just the beginning. The moment she stepped into the wedding hall, conversations stalled. Elle froze at the altar, her smile faltering. Their mother's wine glass trembled in her perfectly manicured hand. Then Elle's fiancé, Nathan, locked eyes with Isabella and went pale. "Wait, this woman is," he stammered, unable to finish the sentence. Isabella smiled, not out of malice, but out of quiet power. She wasn't there to beg for forgiveness or ask to be acknowledged. She was there because she had built a life worth showing off, and today was her stage. At 18, Isabella had nothing, no home, no money, and no plan, just the sting of betrayal and a vow whispered to the night sky. They'll regret this. She worked odd jobs, slept in diners, and scraped by with pocket change. But even in the darkest moments, she never gave up. She studied by street lamp, taught herself business strategies, and eventually earned a scholarship that changed everything. By 23, she had founded a nutrition startup. By 27, it was a multi-million-dollar company. Her name was printed on contracts, her face on magazine covers, but never once did she reach out to the people who left her behind. They didn't deserve the privilege of knowing her rise. Not until now. Back in the ballroom, Elle tried to reclaim control, stepping forward with a sneer. "You're not supposed to be here," she hissed. "Who invited you?" Isabella didn't flinch. She simply turned to Nathan and asked, "Do you really not know anything?" The room fell silent again. Nathan's face was a canvas of confusion, recognition, and fear. Elle's carefully crafted lies began to unravel. With a calm voice and a sharp smile, Isabella reached into her clutch and pulled out a single sheet, Elle's academic transcript, revealing she had flunked out of medical school years ago. The crowd gasped. Nathan looked at his fiancée like she was a stranger. Elle tried to lie her way out, but the evidence was indisputable. That wasn't all. With years of evidence tucked away, Isabella dropped bombshell after bombshell, exposing financial fraud within the family clinic, insurance scams, and embezzlement buried beneath layers of false records. Her parents turned white with panic. Guests whispered. The polished image of the Moore family shattered in seconds. And Isabella? She stood tall, elegant, and unshakable. Then, as if on cue, her husband Adam walked into the chaos, placing a hand gently on her back. He was successful, respectful, and fiercely loyal, the polar opposite of the toxic family she'd left behind. "Is there a problem here?" he asked. His voice steady. The room froze once more. Even Elle couldn't speak. Nathan eventually did. After reading the damning records on a USB Isabella handed him, he called off the wedding on the spot, tossing the ring at Elle's feet before storming out. But Isabella wasn't finished. Her father accused her of being spiteful. Her mother called her vindictive. Elle, in a last-ditch attempt to salvage her reputation, accused Isabella of being jealous. But Isabella, no longer the insecure girl from years ago, replied with poise, "If I'm so irrelevant, why do you all look so nervous?" And then came the final blow. She revealed that her identity, her name and social security number, had been used in a decade-long tax fraud scheme by her father. She'd discovered it only recently, and the authorities were already involved. As her words echoed through the hall, a well-dressed hospital director in the back corner pulled out his phone. Vivian, the family matriarch, fainted. Her father looked like he'd aged 20 years in 5 minutes. Elle dropped to the floor, sobbing as guests stepped back, eager to avoid being associated with the disgrace unraveling before them. Isabella didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. Her power came from patience, preparation, and the unshakable strength of someone who rebuilt her life from ashes. As she turned to leave, Adam by her side, she paused at the door. "You wanted me forgotten," she said softly, "but now you'll never forget me." Outside, under the open sky, Isabella took a breath. For the first time in years, she wasn't carrying the weight of proving her worth. She had nothing left to prove. The people who once defined her were powerless. She looked over at Adam, who squeezed her hand. "Cake?" he asked with a smirk. She laughed. "Yeah, let's get cake." Because revenge wasn't the destination, it was the closure. And what came next was freedom. 10 years had passed since Isabella Gray was thrown out into the storm, framed for a theft she never committed. Her family, once her entire world, had turned against her without hesitation, convinced by Vivian, her cunning stepmother, that Isabella had stolen $5 million from the family business. Her father, furious and blinded by Vivian's lies, Didn't even hesitate. He hurled her suitcase into a puddle, ignored her desperate cries, and slammed the door shut, locking her out of the only home she had ever known. Blood from a ring thrown at her face mixed with rain. Pain from her half-brother's kick ached through her ribs. But nothing hurt more than being betrayed by the people she once called family. Cold, penniless, and heartbroken, she walked away into the storm, not knowing where to go, only that she could never return. The days that followed were bleak. She slept in the back of a greasy diner, worked double shifts to barely afford a shoebox apartment infested with roaches, and went hungry more nights than she could count. But Isabella wasn't the type to stay down for long. The fire burning inside her, fueled by injustice and betrayal, kept her moving. She taught herself finance using library computers, memorized stock charts by night, and soaked up every drop of wisdom from Jack, a scrappy former stockbroker who saw potential in her grit. Together, they made their first trade, flipping a crumbling tech stock into rent money, then kept going, clawing their way up the financial ladder. By the time Isabella turned 30, she wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. Her name was on the building of one of the fastest-growing financial firms in the city. She was wealthy, powerful, and calculating, but more than anything, she was ready. The time had come for those who had betrayed her to pay. She started with Susan, her manipulative aunt who helped fake the financial records that got Isabella expelled from the family and labeled a criminal. Knowing Susan's superstitious nature, Isabella orchestrated a haunting campaign. She mailed her forged ledger pages stained with red ink and eerie messages, hired a fake psychic to prey on her guilt, and even had a man call her home whispering, "Can you hear Evelyn's mother yet?" Susan, believing she was cursed, signed over her bank accounts to a fake company, one controlled by Isabella herself. When Isabella finally confronted her, she dropped the original ledgers on Susan's coffee table. "You taught me how to survive," she said coldly. "Now I'm teaching you how to live in fear." Susan collapsed, consumed by paranoia, her life reduced to boarded-up windows and whispers of ghosts that weren't there. Next was Ethan, her half-brother and now CEO of the very company that once belonged to their father. Unaware that Isabella had been quietly buying shares for years under shell corporations, Ethan strutted around like a king. That is, until the shareholder meeting where Isabella stood up in a tailored black suit and said, "I move to remove Ethan Gray as CEO. Effective immediately." Shock rippled through the room. When Ethan demanded to know who she was, she answered with calm fire, "I'm the nightmare you created." The vote passed. He was finished. But Ethan wasn't going quietly. 2 nights later, he sent men to run her off the road and silence her for good. She barely escaped, bruised and bleeding, but not broken. Jack helped her track down the hitmen, and one flipped on camera, admitting Ethan had ordered the hit. Isabella uploaded the footage. By noon, Ethan was arrested for attempted murder and fraud. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars. But Isabella wasn't done. Vivian, the architect of it all, still lived freely off what was left of the Gray family fortune. Isabella uncovered years of offshore accounts and forged invoices. She sent them anonymously to the press, triggering an FBI investigation. Vivian's house was seized, her assets frozen, and her name smeared across headlines. Furious, Vivian fought back, filing a lawsuit and using her jail connections to have Isabella attacked while she awaited trial. But Jack found an old recording of Vivian drunkenly bragging about framing Isabella. Played in court, it turned the case on its head. Vivian was sentenced to 20 years. Isabella visited her in prison, tossed the old wedding ring back at her, and whispered, "You said I didn't deserve anything. Look at me now." Her father was the final chapter. A broken man now living in a nursing home. His empire crumbled, reputation destroyed. Isabella found him alone, frail, and haunted. He tried to apologize, even showed her a letter, one he wrote the week after kicking her out, begging her to come home. A letter Vivian had intercepted. He wasn't evil, just weak. She left him with a check and a ripped photo of them together. "You picked them over me," she said simply. He died months later, forgotten. Years of pain had forged Isabella into steel. But it wasn't just revenge that defined her journey. It was the way she rose above it. She funded scholarships for girls like her, mentored survivors, and gave second chances to those the world abandoned. In the end, she found peace, not in destruction, but in creation. And when Jack, the man who stood by her through it all, finally said, "I love you," Isabella smiled for the first time in years, not out of vengeance, but out of hope. The past was behind her. The future, finally, was hers. Isabella Gray never expected to spend Christmas raising someone else's kids. But that's exactly where she found herself, 3 days before the holiday. Standing in her driveway with a diaper bag in one hand and a crying toddler on her hip. Her phone buzzed with a message from her parents, gone to Hawaii for the holidays. "Hope you don't mind watching the little ones. Love you." No explanation, no warning, just a cruel assumption that, once again, Isabella would clean up the mess. This wasn't new. For years, they'd treated her less like a daughter and more like a convenient babysitter. Every time her sister dropped off her 3 wild kids, ages 2, 4, and 6, Isabella's parents would vanish. Always with excuses. "You're so good with them," or, "It's only for a few days." But this time felt different. This time, it was deliberate, cold, like they didn't even care if she had her own life to live. She stared at the blinking Christmas lights on her porch, cheap ones she'd hung up to bring some cheer into her quiet little life. She'd been looking forward to a peaceful holiday, a few days off work, hot cocoa, maybe even a Christmas movie marathon. Instead, her house was now filled with screaming kids, shattered ornaments, and the smell of burned cookies. The baby cried every time she put her down. The middle child threw tantrums every hour. The oldest kept asking when Grandma and Grandpa were coming back. Isabella had no answers, no energy, just a rising tide of resentment. But deep down, something else stirred, something that had been building for years, a refusal to be used anymore. By the second day, Isabella had enough. She sat on the kitchen floor at midnight, her hair a mess, tears brimming in her eyes. And that's when she made a decision. She wouldn't be silent this time. She wouldn't just take it. She picked up her phone and called her lawyer. Then she contacted Child Protective Services. Not because she didn't love her niece and nephews, but because it was time someone held their real parents accountable. Her sister had left them with no food packed, no contact info, not even emergency instructions. It wasn't babysitting, it was abandonment. The CPS caseworker listened intently, took notes, promised to investigate, and within 24 hours, they were knocking on her sister's door, and quickly found that she wasn't even in the country. A formal inquiry was opened. What followed was even bigger. Isabella posted a long, heartfelt message online, explaining what had happened, not in anger, but in truth. She shared how, year after year, her parents had put her last. How she was expected to sacrifice everything while they took vacations, and praised her sister for being a great mom, even as she passed off her responsibilities. Her story struck a nerve. The post went viral. Thousands of comments poured in from people who had been similarly treated, used, overlooked, and expected to carry the burdens no one else wanted. Suddenly, Isabella's quiet story became a conversation. Local news outlets picked it up. Parenting forums shared it. Even morning shows called her the unexpected aunt who fought back. But more than that, it put pressure on her family. Her sister, once praised for her social media perfect life, lost brand deals overnight. The online community turned on her fast. As for Isabella's parents, they came back from Hawaii to find themselves publicly shamed, with reporters outside their gated home and friends no longer answering their calls. But Isabella didn't take pleasure in their downfall. What she wanted, what she needed, was freedom. And she got it. The courts granted her emergency custody of the children, not because she asked for it, but because they had nowhere else safe to go. She stood in front of the judge, holding her niece's tiny hand, and made a promise: if I'm going to raise them, I'm doing it right. I won't let them feel unwanted the way I did. And she meant it. She didn't become their mother, she became their safe place, their calm in the storm. And slowly, the kids began to change. They laughed more, slept better, called her Izzy, with trust in their voices. It wasn't easy. There were days she wanted to quit. Nights she cried herself to sleep. But something kept her going. Maybe it was the idea that she was breaking the cycle. That she was giving these kids a life built on love, not obligation. Eventually, her home became something new. Not the silent space it once was, but a messy, joyful haven full of crayon drawings, bedtime stories, and real connection. And then came the holidays. 1 year later, Isabella stood in her kitchen, helping the youngest stir hot cocoa while Christmas music played in the background. The tree twinkled with ornaments they'd made together. No shouting, no guilt, just peace. She smiled to herself, not because things were perfect, but because she was no longer invisible, no longer controlled. She had taken the pain, the betrayal, the chaos, and turned it into something better. And as snow began to fall gently outside, Isabella Gray knew one thing for certain: sometimes family isn't who raises you, but who shows up when it matters most. And this time, she had chosen herself, and found a new kind of family in the process. Isabella Gray stood in the grand reading room of the law office, her heart beating in time with the rain against the windows. The air was thick with tension. A will was about to be read, her late husband Thomas's last words, and across the table sat the woman who'd made her life miserable from the day she married him, Catherine Gray. Her mother-in-law. With her sharp suit, tightly pinned bun, and icy smirk, Catherine radiated the kind of arrogance that made Isabella's stomach churn. She had always seen Isabella as beneath her, an unworthy outsider. Even now, she sat with smug certainty, convinced the fortune Thomas left would be hers. Isabella, in contrast, wore simple black. Her grief was real, not for the man who had slowly grown distant in their marriage, but for the hope that had once lived in her heart. She wasn't here to fight for money. She didn't need it. What she needed was closure. But when Catherine locked eyes with her and sneered, "You'll lose everything," Isabella only smiled. She knew something Catherine didn't, and that secret was about to shatter her world. The attorney cleared his throat, shuffling the crisp pages of Thomas's will. The room quieted. Per the request of Mr. Thomas Gray, this statement is to be read aloud in its entirety before the formal distribution of assets. He pressed play on a small recorder. Thomas's voice filled the room, calm, weary, but unmistakably resolute. "If you're hearing this, I'm gone. And if you're sitting in this room, it's because I wanted you to be. Catherine, mother, I know you never accepted Isabella. I know what you did. The lies, the manipulation, and I let it go on for far too long." Catherine's face drained of color. "But no more. Everything I built, everything I own, is going to the one person who truly stood by me, even when I didn't deserve her. My wife, Isabella Gray." Silence. Then Catherine slammed her palm on the table. "This is a lie," she shrieked. She tricked him, manipulated him at the end when he was sick. The attorney raised a hand. "There's more." He clicked the next recording. A video this time. Thomas's face appeared on screen, frail but focused. "I made this video in case you tried to fight it, Catherine, because I know you, and I know you'll try to twist everything." He looked into the camera, eyes sharp. "This was my decision. Isabella never asked for a cent. She's the only one who loved me without condition. And for once, I'm standing up to you. Goodbye, mother." The room was still. Catherine looked stunned, like she'd been slapped, but then her expression hardened. She stood abruptly and stormed out, muttering about her lawyers. Isabella didn't stop her. She didn't have to. The truth was enough. But the battle wasn't over. A week later, Catherine filed a lawsuit, claiming Isabella had coerced Thomas. She hired Thomas's childhood best friend, Caleb, to testify, a man Isabella had once considered family. Caleb lied on the stand, swearing Thomas wasn't in his right mind, that he'd seen Isabella isolating him, keeping him away from loved ones. The media ate it up. Headlines painted Isabella as a black widow. She walked through crowds of cameras with her head high. But inside, the betrayal stung. It wasn't just about money. It was about being silenced, branded, erased. But Isabella wasn't one to fold. Days before the trial's conclusion, She remembered something, an old recording Thomas had saved on his private laptop. She dug it out from a storage closet, powered it up, and found it, a raw, unedited video diary Thomas had kept in his final months. In it, he detailed the growing abuse from his mother, the regret for not protecting Isabella sooner, and, most importantly, his decision to rewrite the will. In court, Isabella's lawyer played the video. The jury watched in silence as Thomas spoke his truth. Catherine's face crumbled. Caleb's lies fell apart. The case imploded. Isabella not only won the trial, but public opinion swung in her favor almost overnight. Interviews shifted from suspicion to admiration. Her quiet strength inspired others. But Isabella didn't seek fame. She wanted peace. She sold the mansion, donated part of the inheritance to cancer research in Thomas's name, and relocated to a quieter city by the coast. The waves became her therapy. She planted a garden, adopted a dog. For the first time in years, she could breathe. One morning, as she walked along the shore, toes brushing the water, she felt it, the weight finally lifting. She had survived cruelty, betrayal, and public scrutiny, but she had also reclaimed her voice. Isabella Gray was no longer the woman everyone underestimated. She was the woman who had loved deeply, lost painfully, and risen fiercely. The past no longer defined her. And as the sun rose over the ocean, warming her skin, she smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because she had finally made it through the storm. The tension in the air was sharp enough to cut glass as Isabella Gray stood at the edge of the wedding reception. Her name tag pinned in bold letters to her dress, housekeeper. Not wife of the groom's brother. Not sister-in-law. Just housekeeper. It wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. Vanessa, her sister-in-law, and Carol, her mother-in-law, had orchestrated the entire thing, an elaborate humiliation wrapped in fake smiles and white roses. Isabella felt the sting, not just of the label, but of the years of subtle insults, dismissive glances, and cold shoulders that had defined her marriage into the Wilson family. But what they didn't know, what they had never cared enough to find out, was that Isabella had come prepared. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. Instead, she calmly excused herself and returned minutes later with a small envelope. Inside was a neatly folded document, proof of Carol's tax fraud and Vanessa's affair with a high-ranking client's husband, evidence Isabella had collected over the last year. Knowing this day would come, she handed it silently to the wedding coordinator, who opened it in front of the crowd. Murmurs spread like wildfire. The room, once echoing with celebration, grew quiet with tension. Vanessa's face drained of color as whispers turned into stares. Carol's forced smile faltered as she grabbed for the paper, her eyes widening in horror. Robert, Isabella's husband, stood frozen, still pretending everything was fine. He'd always stood by silently, letting his family treat Isabella like a servant rather than a partner. That silence cost him everything. Isabella turned to him now, calm and composed. You could have stood up for me. But instead, you watched. His mouth opened, but nothing came out, just like always. With poise, Isabella walked toward the door. I won't be part of this circus anymore. No yelling, no dramatics, just quiet strength. As she stepped into the sunlight, she didn't look back. She didn't need to. The scandal had begun to unravel inside. And her truth was already doing what years of pleading couldn't, exposing the rot behind the Wilson family's perfect facade. A year later, Isabella sat by the coast, a cup of coffee in hand, the wind brushing her hair. She'd filed for divorce, sold her wedding ring, and started her own consulting business. She wasn't the quiet, overlooked wife anymore. She was her own person, with peace, purpose, and power. The memory of that wedding day still lingered. Not as a wound, but as a turning point. The moment she stopped begging to be seen and started walking toward the life she deserved. Life has a way of testing our strength in the most unexpected and painful ways. One of the most profound lessons from Isabella Gray's journey is the importance of resilience and self-worth in the face of betrayal, rejection, and injustice. Being wrongfully accused, discarded by family, and left to survive alone in a harsh world could have broken her, but it didn't. Instead, it became the fire that forged her into someone stronger, smarter, and more capable than anyone had imagined. For older adults, this story resonates deeply. Many have experienced losses, setbacks, or the sting of being underestimated. But what Isabella teaches us is that we are never too old, too broken, or too late to reclaim our power. The quiet dignity of her response, the refusal to fight back with rage, but instead with truth, evidence, and composure, reminds us that revenge is never as meaningful as redemption. True victory is not in destroying those who hurt you, but in rising above them, thriving in spite of them, and living a life they can no longer control or define. This story also underscores the value of planning, patience, and wisdom over impulsive retaliation. Life often requires us to wait for the right moment to act, and when that moment comes, being prepared makes all the difference. In the end, Isabella didn't just survive, she created something better from the ashes of betrayal. Her story is a powerful reminder that healing doesn't always come with time, it comes with purpose, courage, and the refusal to let others define your worth. For anyone who has been hurt, overlooked, or silenced, her journey is a testament. You are more powerful than your past, and your future is still yours to shape.